What is going on, Hot Take Nation and Digital Wildcatters Nation? We got a very special show today with a longtime friend, a pioneer in the digital media space, one of the early adopters of Twitter in oil and gas, one of the first podcasts, certainly the one I listened to, the first one I was on for sure, and the main man at Frack Slap. If you're following him on Twitter, you know it's none other than Collin McLelland. Collin, what is going on today, buddy?
Dude, nothing much, man. I'm excited to be on the show. I think you've been on my show, twice now?
Twice.
So it feels, it's different to be on the other side and be coming on your show, but I think it's going to be a good conversation today.
Well, it is. So we've done two, and one of my favorites, and obviously it always pre my podcast, but when Mark Bohorich and I came on and we reverse interviewed you and Jacob, which was fun because I think, as a host, you're sort of featuring other people, which is great, and you're having good conversations and learning, but people don't really get a chance to learn about you as much. So today we're going to spend a big amount of time deep diving on Collin.
All right, let's do it. Yeah, and that episode where you and Mark Bohorich came on is still one of my favorite episodes. You guys opened up the podcast just clowning on me and Jake, pretending to be me and Jake opening up the episode, and the banner on there is still one of my favorite times on the podcast.
So let's first talk about what you guys have been doing with the Digital Wildcatters, because you've grown it a lot, and one of the things I've always talked about is I love your tenacity. And I love that you really built a space that didn't exist. And I can think of I think Oil and Gas This Week was another podcast that was kind of going. Ryan Ray had one going. But the Oil and Gas Startups podcast really found a niche or a niche, depending on which side of the border you're on. Talk to me about the genesis of that idea and what that's grown into with Digital Wildcatters.
Yeah, you talked about it. We weren't necessarily the first podcast on the scene. You had Ryan Ray doing his thing, and great guy. And, I think what we were doing was a little bit different with our podcast. So the genesis of Digital Wildcatters was the Oil and Gas Startups podcast. And we didn't even start it as Digital Wildcatters. It was just Oil and Gas Startups. And the way that we got the idea for that was in 2016, 17, you started seeing this wave of digital technology coming in the space. And all these founders had the same complaint. There was just a lack of early stage capital to fund these ideas. And so I was talking to coastal VCs, both on the West Coast and East Coast, and saying, hey, you guys need to take a look at energy technology. And they would always ask, where can we go to learn about these companies? There wasn't a single place on the internet to send them to. And so Jake and I were already having conversations over lunch with these founders. We're like, man, why don't we just put a microphone in front of us and start recording these conversations? And so started Oil and Gas Startups podcast in 2018. And our thesis around that was we wanted founders from tech companies. We wanted E&P management teams, CEOs of large companies to come on and talk about the industry. And yeah, it ended up doing really well and taking off, and parlayed that into some live events called Energy Tech Nights. And then you fast forward to where we're at today, we have a whole podcast network. We're slated to have 9 shows by the end of the year, and, have amazing hosts that come from all different aspects, midstream, downstream, from finance, have guys that have run E&Ps hosting shows. So it's kind of taken this, it started off as the Oil and Gas Startups. That was what we was that podcast. And now we've turned it into a full blown media platform.
Yeah, and I saw that you and a buddy of mine, Robert Norton, just launched a new show, which is sort of like a weekly wrap-up show, if I'm correct. How do you guys, in terms of podcasts, and I think that if you look on the Twitter sphere, there has been a proliferation of podcasts, and podcasts versus mainstream media. I always describe it as like CNN hired Anderson Cooper, handed him a platform, and then built him into a trusted, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, but work with me, a trusted source of news. And they gave him the script to read. And I'm sure you've seen some of those deep state things where all the different news channels, CBS, ABC, Fox, everyone is reading the exact same script. And the difference with podcasting, obviously, is, it's individual personalities, and you're writing your own script. But as you add shows and as you add personalities, and how do you contain the brand, move the brand, let things go, compare to Barstool Sports? Like what's the theory around it? And do you think that there will be a consolidation of podcasts in the next couple months and years, or where do you think podcasting goes?
Well, one, I think that we're in the early stages of podcasting. And it's funny because when I started the Oil and Gas Startups podcast, the main banner from Twitter, from venture capital Twitter, was like, oh, what the world needs is another white guy with a podcast, right? And everyone thought that the market was oversaturated at that point. And I think, what we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years proves that, if you were podcasting, like Joe Rogan, I mean, Joe Rogan was a pioneer, and I mean, he was like kind of the seed of the podcasting movement. I still think that we're in the early stages, but you talk about Anderson Cooper and CNN and what the internet has done over the last 10 to 20 years for media is that it's democratized media. And now people like me, I don't have to have the budget of CNN to get my message out or to get my thoughts out there. I can start a Twitter account, and then I can start building an audience there, and then I can launch a podcast, and I can parlay my Twitter audience to drive traffic over to my podcast, and can do it relatively cheap. And so, with that, there are low barriers to get into the space. But, from my point of view, and you've seen this in energy and oil and gas, I mean, oil and gas, with the 2020 quarantine, everyone and their dog decided to start an oil and gas podcast, right? But the thing is, one, podcasting in itself, it's not hard for me and you to get here on a Zoom call and record this show. But what is like really fucking hard is to do it week over week over week for a 2 to 3 year period to build that audience and lining up guests and editing. And, if you're fortunate and able to monetize, selling advertisements and dealing with clients, it's a lot of work. And so, for us, the way that we look at it is I look at people that I think, one, have the ability to build a brand, a personal brand. So like you look at Chuck Yates, for instance. I mean, Chuck Yates is no brainer. The guy's a character, and, he's loud and he's all over Twitter and promoting his stuff. And you look at that Barstool Sports model where they are a brand that's built on characters. And you look at their marketing material, they're like, we have 60 characters behind the brand. And so that's how we think about things too. We look for people that are characters. We look for people that have been doing podcasts and they've been able to do it consistently over a long period of time. But yeah, I think that kind of answers your questions along the lines of consolidation. Like Digital Wildcatters, I want us to be the kingpins of energy podcasting. And if I see someone that's doing great and I really like their content, I'm going to go find a way to scoop them up and bring them onto our platform and kind of start building this Netflix of energy to where, we have all different types of personalities on there. And I think that that's kind of the vision for us. And I think that's what you're going to see in a lot of different industries as well.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. Which brings me to the brand question, which is the brand of Collin. I don't want to talk. There was a tweet. You and I made a joke like probably a year ago. We were talking, and I told you about that viral LinkedIn post I did. That was like, it was a throwaway. That was sort of like, if you're a manager and you're sending an email at 10:30 at night just to prove that you're working, like stop being a douche canoe and like send it the next day. Like no one cares how hard you're working. And it was like, and it just like blew up. It had like 600,000 views on LinkedIn, which is I think a lot if it's not a picture of like, me half naked, which would I think blow up as well. But the most recent viral one I had was around GPA. And I wanted to start there because you and I have talked about this before. And I think, I can't remember, what was your GPA in high school?
1.6.
1.6. Okay. And then you went from there and you ended up going to work on the rigs, and that's a fair, that's sort of, you went from point A to point B. Walk me through what the first day was like on the rig and what you learned there about work ethic and tenacity and all that, but then tie it back to GPA and your high school experience, because the point I was making was, you don't need a good GPA to be successful. And I think you're a great example of that. I think that there are people who coast through life and expect things to be handed to them, which is not white privilege, it is privilege and entitlement. And then they don't have personal accountability for when they made bad choices. And so to me, I think you're a 4.0 at podcasting. I think you're a 4.0 at building a digital brand. And I think that the message, at least that I interpreted, of the 1.6 in high school was, maybe this thing isn't for me. Maybe you needed a gap, maybe you needed a break, but it ended up putting you on the path to success. And so the person I was talking about in the tweet was 100% not you. So I'm curious about your high school.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. So
there's a lot. That's why I brought it up. That's why I want to start there.
Let me interrupt you real quick. You brought up several posts there. And so the one post that you were talking, I find this funny. And I was telling Jake about this the other day was, you make this post about the 3.6 GPA. I didn't think it was a bad post, but what was funny about it was a sleeper post. No one had seen it, and I retweeted it. And look, the reason I retweeted it is I like talking shit and rubbing my 1.6 high school GPA in people's faces, because that's a chip on my shoulder. And, in the oil and gas industry, I had to deal with a lot of engineers looking down on me for a long time. And so now, you can be like, oh, you need to be humble, but that's who I am. So I retweeted it, and then it blows up and it goes viral. And so, there's this phenomenon on Twitter where the more viral a post goes, the more out of context it gets taken by the additional users that see it. Totally. And so I thought, one, I understood your post. I didn't take it out of context. I didn't think it was a bad post. I'm very hard-nosed when it comes to personal accountability. And I think our society has no fucking accountability across the board, from, the government to the corporations to individuals. And so I got the point of the post. But yeah, for me personally, kind of my line of thinking and, where I came from in high school was, one, I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. And things that I was learning in high school weren't applicable to me in life. I wanted to learn to build businesses and make money. And growing up in Midland, Texas, getting out of high school in 2008, right in the middle of the downturn, I was looking for a job on a rig, finally got one. And I saw, just being in Midland, I was always surrounded by oil and money, and I was fascinated by it. I knew nothing about the oil industry. And so I wanted to go learn the business from the ground up. And so I think that, when I look at the GPA conversation and the credentials conversation, pedigree, everyone always talks about things in a binary lens, right? It's like, oh, you have to go to Harvard to be successful, or, whatever it may be. And I hope that I can be an example for kids out there. It's like, hey, look, you can go take a blue collar job and earn a good living. And not only that, you're not bound to that career or that trade. As long as you're resourceful and self-taught, you can transcend into other things. And so I think at the end of the day, resourcefulness and intelligence aren't measured by a GPA, right? And so that's, I've always had, and my message around university and college used to be a lot more, I used to be, I'd hammer on it. You can ask Jeremy Funk. This is how me and Jeremy actually met each other online, is that we'd get him banners about, college degrees, and I've softened up on it a little bit.
What was your view before? I
mean, I used to think that college degrees were scams, 100%. And it's not the idea of university in itself. It's that if you look at the inflation of college tuition over the last several decades and the return on that investment, and then you later on top the Fed's student loan program, and it's the most toxic form of debt that you can acquire. It's just a totally rigged system, right? And so I used to be very against traditional education. And as I've grown up and I've wisened up a little bit, I've learned that stance it's not always a black and white conversation, right? And so I understand the places for universities, and I still think that the system is completely flawed and broken, but that's kind of, I've softened up on that take a lot over the years.
Well, I think that's what's so great about podcasts is, and I've been on Bloomberg and CNBC and Paul Sankey and some of the other guys that are all in this EFT world, Dan Pickering, but you have 3 minutes, and in 3 minutes, everything is black or white. And everyone wants a hot take, and everyone wants this but we can have a nuanced conversation, because I totally agree with you. I think that for reasons of privilege, in terms of parents put barriers in front of other kids by encouraging their kids when they could afford to send their kids to college, because then if college became a hurdle in an interview process, their kid was given a advantage over a kid who didn't go to college. And then that sort of led to this this bifurcation. I think the best thing that's going to come out of 2020 is that parents are now actually looking at, like, they make the joke, my son was making a joke, so I hope it's not held against him on social media forever, but he's like, people taking lesbian studies in school is like a cool degree, but for $350,000, you're not going to get a job. You would be better to go work at a Chick-fil-A for 2 years, learn the business, buy the franchise. But the point that is being made about the student loan program is you can't get a loan to start a Chick-fil-A if you worked in the business for 2 or 3 years, but you can get a loan to take lesbian studies. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but like, you're saddling someone with 200,000, 300,000 of debt that they'll never pay off. And now with the political infrastructure saying we should pay those debts off, it's like, well, what about the moral hazard of having made a bad decision? And like you came out of high school, you went and got a job, you got way ahead of your peers, you learned how to build a business, and you built a career. Everyone else went to college and expected like someone's going to hand them a management job. So I hope that school gets really rebuilt, and I hope that high school should be around balancing a checkbook, understanding the role of the Fed in the economy, understanding what house prices mean, what the Schiller price index is, how inflation works, how mortgages work. Like, I don't think we're teaching kids any life skills. We're teaching them to kind of like just check the box. Do you agree with that? The college is like a check box?
100%. And I actually had the privilege of going to a private school for a year in Midland, my freshman year of high school. And in that year, I took my favorite class that I took in my 18 years of education, and it was a personal finance class. And we went through Dave Ramsey's financial course.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad or something? Is that what he wrote?
No. That's Robert. Was his last name Kiyosaki?
Okay.
Dave Ramsey is, built a $20 million a year business or something like that, teaching people personal finance and how to pay off debt and things of that nature. But anyways, we moved through that course, and then we also did an exercise where at the beginning of the semester, we had $10,000 and we had to allocate it across 5 stocks. And at the end of the semester, whoever had the best price performance over the semester, won a prize. I can't remember what it was. And I won because I went all in on Google. And so, which was at the beginning of the bull run for Google. So I just got lucky there, but that was like fascinating to me because I love that stuff and I was interested in those things. And I think if, you mentioned that in 2020, you have all these parents that are starting to look at the education system and realize that I think if you look at like having kids, to me is one of the biggest advantages to see where the future is going, because I listen to my 9-year-old talk and I'm very supportive of him being in school and his education, and I think it's extremely important. And you hear him, he's like, I don't even learn that much from school. I learn everything from YouTube. And he does. I mean, the kid's taught himself how to code off of YouTube videos, and this comes back to the democratization of information. It's like, when we had you on our podcast, on Oil and Gas Startups podcast, it was our best performing podcast ever because people could hear from someone that had built and sold an EMP, and people in this industry are fascinated by the idea of starting an oil company. And so now that you had this medium to where, I can go listen to, DRW talk about this topic for 45 minutes, an hour, it's invaluable. Last night I'm here in Austin. Last night, there's one podcast I listened to, and it's the Noah Kagan show. And Noah Kagan was at my friend's birthday party that I was at last night. And Noah Kagan, he was number 30 at Facebook. He was number 4 at Mint. Now he owns a really successful business app, Sumo. And his podcast, he has these great people come on and talk that have built businesses. It's like, traditionally, 20, 30 years ago, you'd have to go to Harvard Business School for those case studies. And now you can get it while you're driving 3 hours to Dallas. You can just binge on podcasts and take in all that information. So I think that you're seeing this huge transformation, and not only the way that people think about education in a traditional sense, but also the way that people produce that content and information as well.
Oh, you're totally right. I mean, I see it in my kids. I mean, the fact that my younger son is in a charter school, that we pulled him out of public school this year. He was not going to be pulled out. What we loved about public school, and always have loved and been a big supporter of, is because you mix everyone, right? And we're going to talk about this in terms of everything going on in 2020, but like every class, every race, every sex, every sexual orientation, they're all thrown in public school and they all go play in the yard every day. And, like my son learned to be less chippy and say less stupid things to kids that were bigger than him and that would fight him. And then he also learned how to like build relationships, and like, so he was a better person for DPS. And then coronavirus came, and Denver Public School, which the real reason is the teachers union, we didn't want teachers to go back to school, but they wanted to still get paid. And so they didn't have enough teachers to physically open the schools. So we pulled him and put him in a charter school. And so he does hockey in the morning. He does an hour of hockey, an hour workout, and 4 hours online. To your point, he's doing like a digital course that's like one course built by a teacher. There's like some help, but it's all videos, and he can go at his own pace. He can pick his own courses. He's trying to get done like 2 years of science and half a year English, like, you know, so they can start driving their own decisions based on what they like, which is hugely different. And then my son, my older son, he is an avid consumer of podcasts, and so he listens to the Ben Shapiro podcast all the time. I'm a little nervous that I have a 15-year-old who is more right-wing conservative than I am, and I'm already pretty right-wing. So, but that's how he consumes, and so he knows so much about politics, and I mean things that Ben Shapiro knows, but he's so much smarter than I was at that age, just because he takes an interest in it. And so we're encouraging our kids to figure out what they like. And if my older son I think he wants to be a golf pro, and not, I mean, the likelihood of him playing golf professionally is low, but if he wants to be a teaching pro, perfect. Whereas 2 years ago, I would have said, no, you have to go to college. You go to the best college we can get you into that's an Ivy, and you pay the money and you do the thing. Now I'm like, wherever you get a scholarship and it's the cheapest, that's where you're going. Whatever degree is the most useful, that has the highest ROI, that's what you're doing. And if you want to be a teaching golf pro because you love it, that's what you're going to do. And I hope that that's what happens. So back to you in terms of working the rig. Tell me about what that was like, because that's like the schoolyard. You're the young kid. I've seen that video on Twitter about when you had to hold the bag of mud over your head. And classic. Or when they tell you to go find the lock to the V door. But so you're out there with all these different guys with different backgrounds, with different experience, with different like socioeconomic upbringings. What was that like, and what did you learn from the guys in the field?
Yeah. I mean, shit, I could talk about that for 3 hours, you know, the lessons that I learned from the oil field. I'll probably write a book about that someday. But, you know, I remember the first day I went out to a rig. I remember the butterflies I got in my stomach. I was scared. You know, I get out there, I pull into location, I get out of my truck, and I just look up to the crown of the rig, and, you know, it's just making all these loud noises. And I was not a handy kid. Like, you know, I didn't grow up with my dad. And so I didn't have someone to teach me, you know, what is a pipe wrench, or much less how does a pipe wrench work. And so I was nervous and scared. And, you know, I was a kid. I wasn't even old enough to buy a case of beer. You know, the second day out to the rig, they sent me in to buy a 30-pack of beer. And I was like, I can't, I'm 19. And, you know, it just starts like, I got treated like that. I got treated like a kid out there. And it made me become a man pretty quick, to say the least. But I learned so many lessons out there. You know, you work 100 hours a week, roughnecking, you know, very labor intensive and hard-nosed job with hard-nosed people. And, you know, the people that you're out there with, I remember going home that first week and telling my parents I was just mesmerized by these people, because they're half redneck and then half geniuses. You know, they understood downhole physics, and they understood how to, you know, change out pump liners. And I was like, it's the weirdest skill set I've ever seen in my life. These guys are missing teeth and fingers, and they'll cuss you out, but they're smart and they understand what they're doing. And so I thought that was, you know, just really interesting. And I spent a lot of my time out there, you know, if we were tripping pipe, if I was cleaning the rig, if I was mixing mud, whatever it was, you know. I told you, I've always been an entrepreneur. You know, back then we were drilling on footage rates, and I'd always be sitting there thinking about the economics of a drilling rig. And I was like, man, you know, I could probably buy one of these things, you know, several $1 million, and, you know, start leasing it out on contracts to E&Ps. And I was just always thinking about the business model of oil and gas. And that's kind of really like, that job sucked. Like it sucked. It was sure, it paid great, but it was dangerous, and it was hard work, and it sucked. Like, no one goes out there and just likes doing it, right? But those are the things that got me through those long days. Was I was using it. That was my education. I didn't need to go to petroleum engineering at Texas A&M, because I was out there drilling and learning the process myself. And so I drilled for a couple of years and then kind of worked up my ranks as a derrick hand. And then they were talking about making me an assistant driller. And at that point, I was like, I think I've kind of learned enough about drilling. I want to learn about completions. And so I went and started running wireline and started at the bottom of the chain over there and started doing a lot of fracking and things of that nature and learned about the fracking process. And so, like, if you look at my career trajectory, I learned a skill set from everyone, and it may not be directly relevant to what I'm doing today, but I always took a lesson from my jobs. And this is actually what I tell people. I have a huge amount of people in the oil and gas industry that reach out to me. They're like, hey, you've inspired me to start my own thing. I want to leave my job. And especially get like a lot of 25, 26-year-olds, they've been at Exxon 1 year and they're like, man, and I hate this corporate life. I can't do this. I need to do something. And I tell people to be patient. I said, you need to be patient. And what skill sets are you learning within that job or that organization that you can take on with you to the next thing, and then eventually build your own company. And so that's how I always thought about, careers. And, even though I was doing these like very blue collar, field level jobs, I was learning things that, took me to the next level, like roughnecking, for example. Like when I got out there, I thought leadership was yelling and cussing out someone and telling them, that they're a fucking piece of shit worm that's no good. And as I started climbing up the ranks, I realized I was like, hey, I didn't like being talked to like that. And I bet you the next guy after me doesn't like being talked to like that. And so I learned what bad leadership was out there and how not to be a bad leader and what good leadership was. And so those are skills that obviously I'm using today, right? And that was something that I learned 10 years ago. So I think that that's, I learned a ton out in the oil field, both from oil operations and life perspective as well.
And that's what I think is so important to differentiate with college, because I do hear a lot of, when you ask people who went to college, most of them say, oh, college was the best because I wasn't living with my parents. I was independent. I was partying and I was balancing life and etc. But you do the same working. And I have really come around on this. I am going to encourage both my sons to take at least a year, if not a 2-year gap year between high school and university, unless there's some incredibly compelling reason they got scholarships for sports teams or something. Because I think that exactly what you talked about, the learning and seeing how hard it is and how, like, you were doing a job that paid well that sucked. Would you want to go back and work on a rig right now? Could you go back?
Yeah. I don't know. I say it all the time. Like 19, 20-year-old Collin would think that 30-year-old Collin's a little bitch. I'm confident in my ability to wake up and go do what I have to do to put food on the table for my family. But yeah, I mean, it'd be tough to go back from what I've been doing the last couple of years to roughnecking, without a doubt.
I heard a story about a guy who was, and again, I don't remember the specific details, but there was a guy who was a drilling engineer and had been out of work for a year because of the downturn recently, and ended up going to work at Amazon in the warehouse. And he was like the nighttime supervisor from like 6 p.m. to 2 p.m. and was making 40 grand a year instead of 200 grand a year. And because he was putting food on the table. But man, there are a lot of really hard jobs. And I think we sometimes forget, like, especially in the coronavirus, those are the jobs that people don't have money to put food on the table. And the business managers and owners that have these cushy jobs don't really feel how hard it is. And many could not go back and do that again. I find
and I look at my dad. So my dad, it's funny because I actually kind of broke the chain of college educated. My grandfather was an Aggie and my dad went to university. And so I was actually the first one out of that lineage that didn't go. But, you look at my dad's one of the hardest working people I know, college educated, senior level management with AstraZeneca in the pharmaceutical industry, then came back to oil and was a senior landman for Conoco and Pioneer Natural Resources. And he got laid off from all three of those companies, got laid off from AstraZeneca during the Great Recession, came over to Conoco, got laid off from Conoco in the 2014 downturn, and then recently got laid off from Pioneer. And guess what? The first thing he did when he got laid off from Pioneer, here in 2020 was he went and applied at Kroger to work the night shift stocking shelves. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the job is. You do what the fuck, you do what you got to fucking do.
Yeah.
And you have to put aside your ego. And my dad's, 62 years old and he's going to be working that job. And I think that people like that are inspirational because, like, look, me or you, like, we could lose what we have at any point, right? And be back down to that point. And so, like, when you ask me that question, it's like, oh yeah, would I want to go roughneck? Probably not. But I know there's a lot of people out there right now that would love a job roughnecking. And if I had to do it to put food on the table for my family, it's something that I would do. But that kind of ties back in the conversation with my dad. I saw that you can be hardworking and you can have the credentials and you can have the resume, and job security is still just an illusion. And so I think that's another important thing to take into consideration. But when I've softened up on my stance on college, one, because I've understand that I have some survivor bias in there, and I realized that boom, like there was a lot of factors there that helped me. And you could talk to someone up in Northwest Pennsylvania, where the coal industry has just died, and they may not have access to that opportunity to go have a $100,000 job at a high school. And so they have to play into the credentials game and get that college education. And so I realize that there's too many variables in the discussion to have a hard stance on this is right or this is wrong. But I believe whichever path that you take, if you're resourceful, hardworking, and you continue to evolve and learn, you're going to be all right.
I really liked your point on, you can be really hardworking and have all the credentials and still get laid off. And the way I describe that is certainly in the context of the oil and gas layoffs right now, but COVID brought more broadly is, and in the book that I wrote, What the Fuck is Wrong with Everybody Else, What They Didn't Teach You in Business School, I sort of describe your career as a river. And you're in there with the people you're in there with now, and you make the best of the circumstance that you have now, but there's no guarantees around what's coming around the corner. And so you got to work hard, take advantage of the opportunities, and then you can't blame yourself if something doesn't go right that wasn't your fault. Like the downturn of the oil price and COVID was not a lot of people's fault. They lose their job and they have to pick themselves up and then look at where they are in life and figure out what they're going to do to put food on the table. And hoping that the industry comes back and hoping that jobs come back is not the right way to go. So you apply and you go grind it out. One of the comments you'd made earlier was something around in high school. Your dad, did you say your dad wasn't around? Was it because he was busy, or did I mishear that?
Yeah, no. So my parents, we lived in Seattle, south of Seattle, and I'm from West Texas originally. The pharmaceutical industry moved us up to Seattle. And so I spent most of my grade school years up in that area. And then my parents got divorced and my dad stayed up there. And then my mom and my brother and myself moved back to Midland. And so we were there for I don't know how many years. And then once my dad got laid off in the recession, he ended up moving back down to Midland to get back into the oil and gas industry and work as a landman, and did that for over a decade.
How is the adjustment culturally? And I think about this because a lot of people are going to end up moving, with this work from home, and people are leaving big cities, whether it's San Francisco or New York, and they're buying places in the mountains. Like I know that the Vail Breckenridge house market is going crazy. So presumably people are coming from somewhere. As a kid in grade school, moving from Seattle to Midland, what were the challenges with incorporating with those kids? I know you were from West Texas, so maybe it was easier, but what advice do you have to parents who are considering, well, I live currently in, wherever, Milwaukee, and I'm going to move to Houston or vice versa for jobs. What would you do different for your kids to help maybe them adjust better?
To be honest, in terms of moving and changing schools, I did that several times in my life as my dad was getting transferred around. And that was never that big of an issue for either my brother or myself. And it's actually something that my wife and I talk a lot about, because we moved to Katy 6 years ago outside of Houston, and we really like it there. We'll probably spend the rest of our lives there, but we have talked about, maybe taking 1 or 2 months sabbaticals, to different cities and whatnot. But, the conversation always comes down to, if you're moving, what impact does it have on your kids, and how are they going to acclimate to the new environment and the new school? And my belief is that kids are extremely resilient and fluid. And so it may be, a little bit of a learning curve for them to make new friends and things of that nature. But I think that that's really good. I think that's really good for development. I think that humans have a tendency to get stuck in grooves and never go outside of those grooves. And I think that change is good. And I think that this is a message for people that have been laid off too. Like, if you look at the situation, it could be like, if you change your mindset, it could be the opportunity for something new to come up, right? I think change and pressure are really good for people. And I think people are scared of it because change is scary, but that's why I like it. It gets me excited. Like I'm always chasing that rush. And that's kind of how it was for us when we moved from West Texas to Houston, just did it on a whim really. And I think that allows new opportunities to come up. So I think if you are looking at moving today and you expose your kids to controlled change, I think that's good for them in their developing years. Like, you're not putting them in a dangerous situation,
Yeah. No,
it's a controlled situation. So like, you should force your kids to be in uncomfortable situations.
Adversity builds character. And I think that one of the key attributes that is totally unrelated to GPA is the ability to build a brand for yourself and be personable. And so I want to pivot the conversation a little bit into Collin the brand. And I know you have a big presence on Twitter with @FracSlap for those who don't follow you. And it's interesting because Twitter is a very weird, it's very different than, like, I am much better in person. I'm much better long form. I was better on LinkedIn. I'm better podcast. I'm better books. I'm better mentoring, because there's nuance in the things I say. And I also realize that sometimes I say things for effect. I believe them, but I take a more extreme view to drive home a point. On Twitter with 280 characters, obviously that's very, very hard because nuance is not a thing Twitter does. You've built quite a brand with Digital Wildcatters and for yourself. What advice do you have to other people who think about themselves as a brand in terms of building it? And how intentional are you about some of the things you do and some of the things you post? And what is your personality online like?
Yeah. I mean, regardless of what anyone thinks, you're a marketer and you're in sales and you're selling yourself and you're marketing yourself. I mean, just if you're sending out a resume, you're marketing yourself, right? And I think that the most valuable thing that you can have in this world is a network. I think that, it just goes along with the cliche saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I believe that 100%. And I believe if you know people and you know things, that's also a very powerful combination. But the world is so connected now with Twitter and with LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and, podcasts, whatever it may be, that literally at your fingertips, you can connect to whoever you want. And I had this paradigm shift several years ago, back in 2016, when I started putting out content on LinkedIn and oil and gas, where 100% of my networking was 100% outbound. And then I had this shift where it started slowly becoming more inbound, to the point where today I would say 99.9% of my networking is people reaching out to me and not me reaching out to other people. And the reason that happens is because I have this big public presence and I've been putting out content. And with that, people know me. And so I think that social media is extremely powerful when used intentionally. And, when it also comes to social media and creating a brand for yourself, the number one question I get is how do I do it? What kind of content do I put out? And for me, I don't put a lot of thought, like my personal Twitter, like I don't put a lot of thought into curating content. Like I just write and I'm authentic and genuine in my thoughts, whether you think I'm a dumbass or you think I'm creative or, whatever opinion you have on me, like that's my genuine self coming out. And so I always think about content as documenting, like I almost use it as a personal diary sometimes. Like sometimes the posts I write are for myself and people may be able to derive value and insight from that. But I really just treat it as documenting the process instead of creating content. And whether you believe it or not, a lot of people think like, oh, no one's going to listen to me. You're not special. You're not a snowflake. There are tons of people that agree with you on topics and think the same way that you think, and or maybe they even disagree with you, but they like the conversation that you bring up. And so I think everybody has the ability with the tools that are on our phones. We look at the iPhone. This is the most powerful device. History is going to look back, and the iPhone is going to be a major technological advance, and just what it's done for being able to capture and document content it changes the world. And I think everyone should leverage that.
Yeah, and I liked, and however you think about content, and I like that you're saying it's documenting a process, but I certainly make that recommendation to people, especially when they're in new jobs. And there is this culture in oil and gas, and maybe less so in the tech industry. I don't know it as well. But in oil and gas, certainly when I first started posting on LinkedIn, people were very surprised, because they were like, well, real dudes with jobs don't post because, oh my Lord, you might say something controversial. And I'm like, I say things controversial in every meeting and every personal relationship I have. The only difference is there's now a larger platform. And I agree, because I put out free content for so long, when it started coming back, then I met so many people through LinkedIn and found out so much about deals that were going on and trends that were happening. And yeah, I strongly recommend to people to think about their personal brand and think about the number of people. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you brought up a really good point, especially in oil and gas, where people are afraid to put out content in fear of retribution from their employers. And I mean, this has been, if you go back, back when you and I were putting out content, I don't know when you started, but, just several years ago, it was unheard of. You didn't do it. And really, that's why, I saw just this huge open lane. I was like, oh my gosh, you have this entire oil and gas community and no one's putting out content. I'm going to be that guy. And you'll hear people on Twitter today say oh, well, you can put out content because it's what you do for a living. You could go back and look 4 years ago. I was still employed and I was putting out content, and I was like, what are they going to do? Fire me? I'm a great fucking hand. They're not going to fire me. And anyways, started building up a brand that way. And I think, what I theorized is coming to fruition today. I was like, look, you're only going to have this wide open lane of being, sole content creator in oil and gas for so long. There's a window, and you're going to start seeing other people doing it. And sure enough, you're seeing other people starting to post on LinkedIn and coming out of their shells, and you're starting to see employers embrace it a little bit more. But I think oil and gas companies need to look at it. Everyone sits and bitches and moans on these panels about, oh, we have a terrible public image with the rest of the world. How do we tell our story? Well, you're not going to tell the story by having Slumberjay post a fucking video of okay, we're going to sit our employees down here and I want you to read this script about why Slumberjay is great and why oil and gas is great. You're going to get a better public perception by having people within the industry tell their stories. And the brand risk association, it's a fallacy in my mind. I don't think that is a huge risk. And, when we look, the reason that Digital Wildcatters will succeed is because not only do we support it, we encourage it. Like Jake and I are right now talking about, hey, we need to have manuals and processes to teach anyone. We want everyone within Digital Wildcatters to be present online and have a brand if they choose. Yeah. And we encourage that. And guess what? Yeah. Someday someone could say something that's controversial, and who cares? Who cares? I'll deal with that then. And I'll answer it if it's the case. And look, if it's just something that's just batshit crazy that dude, why are you posting racist shit online? Well, one, that's a major character flaw, and I don't want you in my organization anyways. Yeah. And I would never hire anyone like that. But I just think that everyone always looks at the negatives and the cons and the risk, and they don't look at the reward. And I'm like, it's such a asymmetrical conversation. The reward is so much greater than the risk associated with it.
The advice I would give to people who are concerned about what they're posting is, I would say you need to be very clear about what freedom of speech is. Freedom of speech is you can say anything you want, but others can punish you for it. And so if you think about the context of what your employer is, and maybe if you are at Exxon and there is a culture of don't post, that's probably not a great idea. But if other people in your organization are posting and you're not posting character flaw-y things, but expect to be punished. I mean, it would be a lie if I said that for the hot take of the day, there hasn't been some negative consequences, because I have called people out when other people haven't been willing to. But the positive context was that I was just saying what everyone else was thinking and talking about in private. And I think it helped elevate conversations. And with where I was in my career, the thing that I wanted to do with my career, I was willing to accept the consequences, even if I didn't always foresee what those consequences were. But as you're creating content, understand what you're trying to drive, what you're trying to sell, and how it's going to be beneficial. And then own that if you put something out there that pisses people off, you might drive some of your things away, which is interesting because I had the COVID. I didn't have the COVID. I had the early COVID take in March that it was bogus. And not that it's not a real virus, because it is, but that you could look at the data coming from the Diamond Princess. And I think everyone forgets, like everyone's like, well, we didn't know until now. And Joe Biden is saying we should reopen schools. Well, Trump was saying in April, we should reopen schools, because the data at the time was the Diamond Princess. We had fatality rates coming off of a cruise ship that was floating around the ocean. There was no mask. There was no filtration. No one knew about it. They were all old. There were 3,700 people. 700 got infected. 7 died immediately, and 14 over the course of time. That's a 2% fatality. We knew it wasn't 10. It ended up being, 99.98% survival for people under 40 or under 50. But I lost a lot of followers on LinkedIn that people were saying, stick to your lane and energy. And I'm like, well, I don't think it's a lane. My lane is data. And the data is telling me that this is not as bad as everyone's saying. And nothing is going to change, even with this vaccine. If you've been reading online, it's like, so we rushed a vaccine to market that's 94% effective based on 22,000 people who got injected and just got sent in the world. It's not like we sent them in a room to get coughed on. And 7 got the virus versus 100. And then some of them are having allergic reactions, and we haven't tested it on people under 16, and some people get facial paralysis. But don't worry, the vaccine's going to save everything. And I'm like, yeah, but at a 99.98% survival rate, why are people taking vaccines? The point of all this is not about coronavirus, but it was a controversial take that people actively did not like. And it made me lose followers and make a much more controversial figure. Now, in all of your things that you've posted, are you more mindful about weighing in on a topic that maybe has that ramification, or do you just do you and whatever the topic you're going to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I just do me. So, kind of going back to your conversation around the COVID things and this is so stupid, like, losing followers around it. It's like, I didn't agree with your early COVID takes, and that's fine. It's like freedom of speech. You have, like, you're putting up your thoughts, you're backing it with data, and that's what you think. Cool. I'm going to go on about my day. Not that big of a fucking deal, right? And so one, to unfollow, like, I don't know, I just have a hard time getting in that mindset. But look, if you're putting out content like myself, you're not going to have everyone like you. And it is extremely ignorant to think that you can just go through this life and have 100% of people like you. It does not happen. I was just reading Kobe Bryant's book the other day, and he talked about this same exact thing. He's like, when I understood that no matter what I did, there'd be people that didn't like me, that's when he really started living life, because regardless of what he did, there's going to be people that loved him and people that hated him. And it's the same thing. You can go for sure find people in the oil and gas industry who don't like me. And that's just part of it. Like, the way that I look at building audiences and brands is 50% of people are going to hate me, 50% are going to love me, and 10% that love me are like really going to be active supporters. And so, I try to stay, and it depends on the platform as well. On Twitter, I have a lot of banner that's around energy and finance and memes and things of that nature. I try not to get heavily involved in politics or religion, just because I have no interest in discussing those with people, and you're not going to change people's minds. So that's not my MO. But yeah, I think the only negative consequence I've ever had is when I posted a meme that might have been a little distasteful in some people's, like, it's not distasteful for me. Like I post shit like that all the time.
And that meme that you posted was going around the internet, and everyone had already seen it by the time you posted it publicly.
Yeah. And the fun, like it was viral already. But even then, it's hard to label that as negative, because for us, it had a lot of positive things. I was at a whiskey bar yesterday, and, there's two guys from a management team in there. And, one of them's like, hey, tell them about that time that, you posted that meme and got canceled on LinkedIn. And so like, there's like, people are going to love you and people are going to hate you. And regardless, like, dude, I just, my whole view on life is, one, I'm not a very religious person in the first place, and I don't understand, why we're here. But what I do understand is that our time on this earth is limited, and someday I could die on my way driving back to Houston today. I could get in a head-on collision and I'm gone. And guess what? None of this matters. None of this matters. Your opinion on me, DRW's opinion on me, doesn't matter. And so that's how I move through life. I care about my internal happiness, the well-being of my family. And if someone doesn't like me, fuck them. And guess what? It's worked out pretty well. And I think when you have that attitude and you understand that people are going to think that your opinions are stupid and that you're stupid, and you get over that, then you can really start to grow as a person, because you don't care about other people's opinions. And you see this in old people, man. Like, go talk to like 70 and 80-year-old people. Like, they just don't give a shit anymore, because they understand, like, it doesn't matter. And so I think people, they let their egos get in the way, and they care too much about what others think about them. And especially, you've been a victim of this. You get on Twitter, and there's a bunch of people that are behind anonymous accounts saying, oh, this guy's a fucking dumbass, and whatever it might be. And it doesn't matter. So I think that, one, most people that want to build a brand for themselves probably won't go to the extremes that you and I do, to where, we're creating this amount of content. And I don't think they have to, but just being active on social media and documenting what, your process and your journey, I think is really important. And it opens up a ton of networking opportunities. So if there's negatives that come with that, like, you quote unquote negatives, you can say they're negatives. I don't think they're negatives. It's just different.
I like the nuanced point that you make there, because people don't need to generate you to be present online. You don't need to generate that much. And I'd also say that people are very fickle. So every 90 days, you can probably reinvent yourself as something new. So like, it's not the end of the world if, right? It's not the end of the world if like some people get pissed off, because like people are going to, like, I'm sure that your view of my COVID take in March has evolved given that the data has come in December. Just like
absolutely.
Industry, when I came out in November of 18 and started writing the hot take of the day, I was saying, we're running too many rigs, we're growing production stupid, we're going to have a crisis of balance sheets, we have to pay down the debt. If we don't do this, we're done. And I got so much hate for that take early on. And then like a year later, everyone's like, it turns out that he was right. And so I think, as I've thought about my brand, is I try and look at things that are going to be impactful in the world, and I try and like make them relevant. And the problem I'm having right now is like the stock market, and we're going to talk about Bitcoin now, but the stock market is, to me, I'm 43. And so I very vividly remember in 1999, I had just started my career. So I was in the workforce, and the stock market went up every single day. And then the Fed would raise interest rates from like 3% to 3.75%, and the stock market would fall like 3%. I'm like, what are they doing? Why is the Fed raising interest rates? And people would say, well, it impacts inflation and it's getting too hot, so they're trying to cool it down. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. And then the thing, I mean, I had techs who were making 30 grand a year that bought $3,000 worth of stock, and then within a year it was worth $300,000, and they didn't sell it, even though it would have been life-changing, because they're like, well, it's going to go to 6. I remember all of that, and I remember the pets.com mania. I remember Enron, and then I remember the collapse. And it feels so similar to now, except that the Federal Reserve, instead of raising interest rates to cool things down, is like using the what's that thing for the fireplace, like the blower, and it's
the puffer thing.
The puffer thing. And it's just, but I don't know when the bubble pops, but I know when the bubble pops, everyone's going to be like, oh yeah, we totally saw that coming. because they're only obvious in hindsight. That's what I am most concerned about in my life right now, is what's going to happen
Yeah.
when the bubble burst. But you've
Yeah.
been a big advocate of Bitcoin for like a long time. I'm curious how you think about the world and the market and Bitcoin and what you're seeing in this current state of finance.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if we talk about the tech bubble, I didn't have the privilege or the advantage of living through that and seeing it real time. I was 8 years old, so wasn't very much into the stock market at that time. But I always look at the parallels, and it's very easy for someone like me to look back and be like, man, this has so many characteristics. And man, I don't even know where to start with this conversation, because I get really concerned with the economy and the stock market. And, I don't have money actively in the stock market because I feel like it's inflated. But at the same time, you bring up the Federal Reserve and what they're doing, just, pumping all this liquidity into the market, and it's insane, right? And I'm a big follower of Peter Lynch and his writings, and Peter Lynch, legendary investor, in my mind, the best investor, ran the Magellan Fund, and in one of his books, he says that the worst mistake that you can make as an investor is trying to time markets. And he said he learned this very early on, that you'll miss running with the bulls trying to avoid the bears. And I always think about that. But I also think that we live in such a different time than when Peter Lynch wrote those books, starting with the 2008 financial crisis and the bailouts that we saw there, and everything that we've seen given COVID eclipses that. And it's just crazy. Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports became famous for saying stocks only go up. And, it gets to the point where it's almost hard not to believe that, right? But at some point, fundamentals matter. And the way that our economy works matters. And it's hard not to have that in the back of your mind, thinking at some point this has to come crashing down, or else we just experience, exponential inflation that we just can't manage. And maybe that's the path that we go down. But if you look at Bitcoin, I was first introduced to Bitcoin 2011, sometime around then. And the person that told me about it was a kid that I went to high school with in Midland. His name was Crypto Cowboy, and he was a oil and gas corn-fed big boy that came from the oil field. And he was telling me about Bitcoin and how it's going to revolutionize the world. And I thought that it was like a scam. Like, you used it for silver, for Silk Road, and to buy shit online. And at that point, the most that I looked into it was how to buy Bitcoin. And you couldn't just go to an exchange and buy it. Like, you actually had to access a terminal to get Bitcoin. It wasn't easy or consumer grade. And so one of the biggest regrets that I have in life, and not biggest regrets, but one of the biggest learning lessons that I've had, was I wasn't open-minded and willing to research and learn about something. And I was very close-minded, and I wrote it off. And guess what? Me and my wife, or she was then my current girlfriend, we didn't have kids. I was making all this money roughnecking. I could have put one check into Bitcoin, and it would have changed my life.
Right.
And so I think about that a lot in investing. And, you look at Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was developed in the financial crisis. And essentially, Satoshi, the creator of Bitcoin, whoever that might be, said there has to be a better way to build a financial system. And so you can go back and read the initial white paper that he wrote. And there's a lot of conversation around, was Bitcoin intended to be a store of value, or was it intended to be a currency? Doesn't really matter in my mind. But you look at it now, and 2017, you had this bull run in Bitcoin. It goes up to around 20,000 and it crashes. And this has happened throughout the 10-year history of Bitcoin. It's been so volatile. But if you look at it on a long enough time horizon, it just keeps going up. And the reason that it keeps going up is because you look at basic economic principles, network effects, supply and demand. I mean, these are fundamental principles of economics, and Bitcoin is built on top of those. It's not controlled by anyone. It doesn't give a shit what you think about it. It just keeps operating. And as long as people have faith in the Bitcoin network, there's going to be demand for it. And there's a limited supply. You know, only 21 million Bitcoin will ever
and
be
there's
in
19,
circulation.
Am I right? Is it 18 or 19 have been mined to date?
Yeah, something around that. So over the next couple of decades, we'll hit the peak supply of 21 million. And you start looking at, you know, everyone always makes the gold comparison. And I think, obviously, I understand the importance of gold, but you look at gold and it's like, I can't take a gold bar and pay for my meal at the diner with it. I can't, like, what the fuck do you use gold for? It has no utility. You know, the store of value that is gold is our belief that it's a precious metal.
Yeah.
And even at that, it's not. If you go across the universe, gold's not a precious metal. Asteroids have tons of precious metals on them, right?
So but is that the challenge a little bit with Bitcoin though? And the thing, again, I'm with you. Like, you know, you look back and you say, well, I could have bought Amazon at $50 a share and now it's 4,000 a share, or I could have bought Tesla and held it. And I think that the investment decision is hard, but like then you only see it in hindsight. And so I think Tesla is a great example. It's $626 a share. You have all these passive funds that have to go buy like $100 billion worth of the stock. And it's a cult stock that no one wants to sell. But like at the core, its only profitability is selling carbon credits. And it just did a $10 billion equity raise over the last 3 months, two pieces of $5 billion to get cash because their business is not generating cash. So you can see when it collapses. With Bitcoin, there's no way the Federal Reserve or the European banks or the big governments that control money are not going to step in and regulate digital currencies. Maybe no way is too strong, but like the reason the Federal Reserve is like changing the economic cycle in their view is they continue to pump liquidity. If there's only 21 million coins ever, you can't pump liquidity. You can't control it. The market is what it is. Market cycles go, Bitcoin crashes, Bitcoin goes up. But the Federal Reserve and ECB are actively trying to end the business cycle through liquidity. So my thinking is the biggest risk is that it just gets regulated away or something. What do you think about that?
Well, you can't regulate Bitcoin. You can make it hard, and you can set up barriers that make it where there's not adoption of Bitcoin, but you can't regulate Bitcoin.
Right.
And so like this is the balance between theory and practicality. But in theory, you can't stop me from setting up a node and mining Bitcoin and transacting. You can't. But what you can do as a government is you can shut down cryptocurrency exchanges. You can shut down Coinbase. You can shut down Gemini. You can make mining illegal if discovered. And so essentially a government could end Bitcoin if they wanted, in my mind.
Right.
And yeah, I'm surprised they haven't done it already, to be honest. But I think at this point, you know, everyone talks about the volatility and the risks associated with Bitcoin. And one, it's been around for a decade. And I think that's a huge milestone. You know, a decade with a 99.9% reliability rate on the network is just insane. Bitcoin, while in theory could be hacked with the 51% attack, it can't, in practicality, it can't be hacked. And so now you're starting to get this level of adoption, especially in the last 6 months to a year, with everything that's been given with COVID, where you're seeing major fund managers and billionaires, I mean, putting a lot of money into Bitcoin. And so now it's getting that critical mass to where I don't think you like what happens now, you know, you get to, I don't know what the market cap for Bitcoin is off the top of my head, but you get to a certain point on the market cap. And if you just end it, you'd be destroying wealth for a ton of people. Like, how's that beneficial to your economy, right? So the longer that Bitcoin runs, the harder it becomes to kill. And, you know, that's why I'm extremely bullish on it. I love it because it's not controlled by any entity. And it operates off of basic economics. And I think that people need to understand, you know, the problems that the crypto industry has had in the past is that people they try talking about the technicalities and the technology of blockchain, and no one cares about that. no one cares about the protocols that the internet runs on. People just want to know that, oh, I can type in Google and I can get to websites. They don't care how the internet was built. And the same thing is going to be true for Bitcoin. No one gives a shit about blockchain technology. They don't. And they want to be able to go on Coinbase or Gemini and buy them or transact, which, I've had big transactions, international transactions. I've sent, 5 figures to Australia. I've sent 5 figures to Canada, and the ease of use compared to a Swift wire transfer was amazing. And it cost me pennies to send it. And so those are the things that people care about is how easy is it to use and how is it controlled and transacted. And I think you're starting to get the technology stood up around that to where people can easily, my stepdad, 65-year-old, he's buying Bitcoin. And it's easy for him to go on a website now, click a button and buy it, and he can set up a wallet and hold it in that. And so, if anyone wanted to understand the thesis of Bitcoin and why it's important, there's a book called The Bitcoin Standard, which is a really great book on that. But yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think people give a shit about the technology. And it's the same. There's some great YouTube videos where you can go back in the early 90s, like on the Today Show on ABC. People are talking about email and the internet. They're like, what is an email? I think that's how Bitcoin's going to be someday. Right. People don't understand it now, but they will understand it in the future. And the idea of, people say, oh, it's fake currency. It's just a number on a screen. It's not that. If I send you an email, if I send DRW an email, it's just a carbon copy of an email. We both possess copies of that email. If I send you a Bitcoin, I no longer possess the Bitcoin. DRW possesses it because it's gone through the Bitcoin network and it's been verified on the ledger. And I think people have a really hard time conceptualizing that I can send you something digitally and you physically own it. And it's because nothing like that has ever been done before.
Well, yeah, and one of the things I actually loved about that summary is it's faith. And if the thing that also has been interesting to me on COVID is I don't think the vast majority of people truly understand the economy, the role of the Fed, or that the US dollar is this fiat thing that is like, it is a fantasy thing, kind of. And it's faith that runs the US dollar. And when faith is broken, bad stuff happens to currencies. And so as long as the faith continues in Bitcoin, it's going to keep running. So what is next? Go ahead.
Real quick, if anyone's listening and they're interested in the Fed's role in the economy, Ray Dalio has a really good video on YouTube. I think it's called How the Economic Machine Works. And it teaches you about long-term debt cycles and short-term debt cycles and how the Fed is there to inject liquidity and, lower interest rates, raise interest rates to kind of control these cycles and level them out. And you look at where we're at right now. I mean, it really looks like we're at the end of a long-term debt cycle and the Fed's done all they can, bottomed out with interest rates. And that's what makes me concerned about what happens in the future. But I try to be an optimistic person. I am optimistic by nature, but when I look at the markets, the bear in me comes out and I'm like, man, this ends not in a good way. But
yeah, Danielle DiMartino Booth, who we had on the show probably 25 episodes ago, wrote a book. She was with the Federal Reserve and she wrote a book called Fed Up. And it's sort of like the moral hazard a bit of the Federal Reserve. And I think that's, you also made the point about if you regulate Bitcoin, a lot of people lose a lot of money. And I think the challenge right now is, Donald Trump as president was a massive cheerleader of the stock market. And so, and he basically told everyone the playbook. Like, and this is what I missed in January. I was thinking of fundamental economics of like companies, but like Donald was like, we're going to print so much money that this thing is going to go up, and like it's going to be the greatest thing ever. And so, unfortunately for Biden, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter. You have a president who's coming in at the tail end of a cycle where if monetary policy was done more tightly, and if they raise interest rates to offset true inflation, or if they stopped buying Apple bonds, and let's be clear, Apple needs no help with bonds. If they're bailing out the airlines, when let's be clear, no one is flying at the rate we used to. 50% of planes are sitting on the tarmac, and Boeing needs a bailout, and American Airlines needs a bailout. If the Fed required that they raised $5 billion of equity to go with the $5 billion bailout, then there'd be price discovery in their stock, and the stock market would fall to 2,800. And I think the only reason that the society is even working right now is because all the wealth feels richer. And even though the economy is shut and restaurants shut and lockdowns and like no one's allowed to do anything and civil liberties have been taken away, everyone with assets feels richer. And the learning that I've had coming out of this is the top 10% own 84% of the assets. And the Fed has inflated those by 35% at the expense of the people at the bottom who have no savings, who work in restaurants, who work in hospitalities, who work on rigs, who live paycheck to paycheck, who don't have assets. And when people see how bad this asset bubble is, Occupy Wall Street from 2008, which you'll remember from the Great Recession, is going to be 3x. Because people are going to be like, so
I would say 10x.
10x. Like, I'm actually shocked that there have not been more Occupy Wall Street right now, because like it has been companies like Tesla. Do you remember in March, Tesla cut staff, worked more overtime, and cut salaries because they weren't profitable, and they needed to get profitable to get added to the S&P. And so they their employees are getting crushed, and the market cap of the company's up 700%. And people haven't yet been mad about that. And it's crazy to me.
There's such a disconnect between the economy and the stock market, and it's very troubling. I love the stat that you just threw out about 84% of stocks being owned by 10%. I threw that stat out at a cocktail party last night because we were talking about stock investing. I was like, look, this is how I filter companies that I'm interested in. I go on my Fidelity account and I filter by institutional ownership. And if I know that the institutions own 90% of the stocks, I'm looking to get ahead of that money. So my first filter is looking at companies that have a low institutional ownership, because I want the institutional money to come in and start pumping up that stock, and I want to be in there before them. But that's the way that the game is played now. And I think that understanding fundamentals of business and markets actually really hurts you in the way that the market is operating now, because none of it makes sense. And it's a little discouraging. You know, I was talking to Dan Pickering on Twitter about this. It's like you leave money on the sidelines and you're not participating because it doesn't make sense. And then you see these guys on Twitter and Reddit that are making money because they don't really know any better, and they're just putting money in, and the market goes up. And so, you know, I'd love to say that I have the answers for how it ends, but there at some point the economy and the stock market have to converge to some point of reality. They have to. They can't have this disconnect that long. And, you know, you brought up a good point with the Fed buying bonds. It's like, why are these guys not going out and raising equity? It's bullshit. You know, you have all this insider ownership. They keep buying up the stocks in their company, and they take over more ownership. And then when it comes time for a bailout, that's on the public taxpayer. It's like, no, fuck you. You issue some equity and sell part of your company to raise more money. That's what you need to do. And so it comes back to accountability. There's no accountability in corporations or management or the government or individuals. And you start having this lack of accountability at all the different levels, and it balloons up until we get what we have today.
It gets kind of tinfoil hatty, and I, like you, I try to be an optimist, although I have discovered that I am a lot more cynical and pessimistic than I've ever been. And so I'm hoping, so I'm working on that, but it's tough. So what is next for Collin? What does the next 5 years look like? I mean, we started the show talking about the Digital Wildcatters. We're going to end the show talking about the Digital Wildcatters. I think it's super cool what you guys have done and what you're building. What do you think happens in the next 5 years? Do you go out of energy? Do you go into like broader topics, the economy, like a larger base? Do you stay in energy? What happens in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so next 5 years for Digital Wildcatters is we're very honed in on the energy industry. And so while we have our foothold in oil and gas, we're already starting to kind of wedge out into clean tech. You know, I think geothermal is a, great adjacent industry. I'm talking weekly with clean tech founders and really bridging the gap between the oil and gas industry and clean tech. I think clean tech has a ton of knowledge and expertise that they can leverage from the industry. And I think that the oil and gas industry needs a path to move forward to in the future. And so for us, we're going to continue growing as a media company, building communities in the energy industry, both in oil and gas and clean tech. And then I also think that there's a really big opportunity for us. We've already started developing the platform for a social media platform that's specifically tailored to energy. And so if you look at everything that's happening on LinkedIn and Twitter, obviously, better as good as anyone, you got deplatformed from LinkedIn. And I think LinkedIn has a lot of flaws that we talked about, with people afraid of retribution from their employers to post anything. And you go over on Twitter and most of the community is anonymous. And with that, you have an issue with trolling. And there's also a huge problem with indexing information. There's some great conversations on Twitter, and after 2 days, it's lost. So we've developed a platform that siphons and centralizes conversations from both of those platforms, and allows the energy industry to have a platform for communication to discuss topics with their peers. So we're really looking, I think we're at the forefront in terms of media companies actually evolving into tech companies. Once you have all this distribution and these views, you can start pushing out products. You look at Barstool Sports. The reason Penn National acquired them was because Penn National wanted to develop a gambling app to go head to head with FanDuel and DraftKings. Well, how do you do that when those guys have the network effects and they've been in the game for so long? Well, you go acquire a media company that has a huge cult following, and then you distribute your tech product through that. So I think that we're going to be at the forefront of media companies that evolve into tech companies that just happen to be really good at content creation and marketing. Yeah. And so that's what we're looking to do over the next 5 years.
I love it. Now, last two questions. If you could tune anyone up using your expansive MMA skills, who are you taking down right now?
Right now. Yeah, I got two right off the top of my head. So Jake Paul, can't stand Jake Paul. And actually I got suspended on Twitter. So if you don't know who Jake Paul is, Jake Paul and his brother Logan Paul are really famous YouTubers. And
Logan Paul, isn't he fighting Mayweather?
Yeah, so he's going to fight Mayweather. And so these guys, I'm going to give them credit where credit's due, because these guys are absolutely killing it on YouTube, and they've parlayed that into making a ton of money on pay-per-view boxing, but their boxing skills are very amateurish. But these guys come out and, Jake Paul, after his last fight, he started calling out Conor McGregor, saying how he would fuck up Conor McGregor. It's like,
good luck
dude,
with
you're
that.
Not even in the same universe. So anyways, so he was actually attacking Conor McGregor's jiu-jitsu coach several months, 6 months back on Twitter. And I retweeted Conor's coach, and I was like, dude, go break this guy's leg. And Twitter suspended me for that, for a violent tweet. So I can't say anything about him on Twitter anymore. So Jake Paul, love to fight Jake Paul. And then Tai Lopez. Do you know who Tai Lopez is? Okay, so Tai Lopez went viral back in the day. He had this video. He rented these Lamborghinis in this mansion, and he goes out to his garage. He's like, you want to know how I got this Lambo? Reading one book a day. And he started building this following, telling everyone that to become a millionaire, you read one book a day. And it was just a load of shit. And then he starts selling all these scam courses and whatnot. And he's made millions and millions of dollars off of it. And anyways, a lot of the internet can't stand the guy, and I would become the people's champion if I beat him up. And I saw him post the other day that he has a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So there's no reason why we can't get at least a grappling match lined up.
Well, for what it's worth, you're my people's champion. Where did the joke come from about smoking a pound of weed? Because I don't know much about weed. I know if someone, let's just say a random friend, happened to randomly be in a place, not me, obviously, and took 5 milligrams of a gummy, they might be so high for 6 hours that they laugh hysterically and have to get sent home in a cab. Again, want to be clear, not me, but I've heard that story about someone who was similar to me. So I can't even imagine the effect of a pound of weed. And where did this joke about smoking a pound of weed come from?
Yeah, so I made a post. This was on April 20th, 2020. So it was for 2020. And that was the date that oil prices went negative. And so I made this joke. I can't remember the exact price of oil, but I think we were somewhere around $15 or $20. So we were a long ways away from $4. And I said that the joke was, if oil hits $4.20 on 4/20/20, I swear I'm smoking a pound of weed on YouTube Live. Like, there was like no way that it was going to go down to $4.
Yeah.
And sure enough, blew past $4, right?
Minus 37.
Negative 37. And anyways, the tweet went, pretty viral on Twitter, and obviously was a big deal in the energy FinTwit community, and became this big deal. And once it hit that, it was funny. I got 2 texts, one from my wife and one from my attorney, and they're like, "Are you really going to smoke weed on YouTube Live?" And I thought it was funny that they didn't put it past me to do that. But yeah, I threw out this just outlandish bet or tweet, and anyways, Energy FinTwit has held me to that ever since, in which they should. It's like, I haven't held up on my word that I would smoke a pound of weed on YouTube Live, and I'm pretty sure I'd probably die if I tried that.
I would go with that. I'm going to say that's. I don't think that you have to hold up your end of the bargain on that particular facetious, because there's really no other side of the bet. So other than maybe you're maybe welching a little bit, but I know people who welch on bets, and when I call them on it, they're just like, they don't even acknowledge it. So you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, there was no. Yeah, I know who you're referencing. Yeah, there's no other side of the bet for me. It wasn't advantageous for me at all. But yeah, it's something I've been held to. So that's where the pound of weed comes from.
I love it. Well, I love chatting with you. As you know, we've been friends for 2 years. I love seeing what you guys have been accomplishing. I think you and Jake have a great relationship, and I love the stable you've built of podcasts. I agree. It's on the forefront and in the first inning, and I think that you're going to continue to do amazing things. And I really enjoy the memes that you do and the videos that you do, because those are some funny, great things. So if you don't follow Digital Wildcatters, please do. Check out their podcast, and check out Collin at Frack Slap on Twitter. Collin, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey man, thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you always, dude.
All right. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.